Hello, I'm Carlton Van Putten, founder and CEO of PayRent. Welcome to the Keys to Success podcast, where we unlock the secrets to smarter investments, smoother tenant management, and bigger profits, one episode at a time. Ready to master your property game? Let's dive in.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Keys to Success. We're here to help you, navigate the ins and outs of being a landlord.
That's right.
And today we're tackling a topic that can be a real minefield if you're not careful: eviction notices.
Yeah, eviction notices.
Specifically, we're zeroing in on the 3-day notice to pay rent here in California.
That's right. It's a powerful tool for landlords, but as they say, with great power
comes great responsibility.
great responsibility. There are so many nuances and potential pitfalls
Right?
that can trip you up if you're not completely on top of the process.
And that's why we have you here today, to break it all down for us.
Absolutely.
Now, I was going through our source material
Yeah.
and came across something that's a bit of a shocker. Apparently accepting even a partial rent payment
Oh, wow.
from a tenant after you've issued a 3-day notice can actually void the entire thing.
You're kidding.
You could end up having to start the whole eviction process from scratch.
Wow, it's a perfect example of why it's so crucial to understand the legal weight of this document.
Right?
It's not just a strongly worded letter, it's a legal process that needs to be followed to the letter. Think of it like a recipe,
Yeah,
at least one ingredient or step, and you might end up with a very different outcome than you intended.
So no improvising in the kitchen when it comes to evictions.
No.
And speaking of following the recipe precisely, our sources also stress the importance of making sure the notice includes crystal clear instructions on how the tenant can pay.
Absolutely. You'd be surprised how many landlords make the mistake of being vague about payment methods.
Really?
Or forgetting to include crucial details like where to send a check or a money order.
Oh.
Remember, you want to make it as easy as possible for the tenant to rectify the situation.
Makes sense. After all, the goal here is to get paid, not to get bogged down in legal battles because of a technicality.
Right.
Now, another thing our sources highlight is something called the insufficient notice period.
Okay.
Apparently, weekends and holidays don't count towards those 3 days.
Oh.
So if you serve a notice on a Friday, the tenant might actually have until the following Wednesday to pay up.
That's a common pitfall, especially for newer landlords.
Oh, really?
It's not just about counting 72 hours on a clock. It's about understanding how business days factor into the equation.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners here? Is it just to triple check the calendar and make sure they're giving tenants the full 3 business days?
That's a great start, but it goes deeper than that. It's about understanding that the 3-day notice is a legal document with serious implications. It's not a tool to be used lightly or as a way to punish tenants.
It's about ensuring a clear and fair process for both parties, right?
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial point, making sure you've got legitimate documented grounds for issuing the notice in the first place. Retaliatory evictions, say serving a notice because a tenant complained about a leaky faucet,
Oh,
are completely illegal.
yikes. That's a good reminder to always have a solid paper trail for all landlord-tenant interactions.
Yes, always document everything.
Speaking of paper trail, our sources also emphasize the importance of accurately identifying both the rental unit and the tenant in the notice, using full names and correct addresses.
Yeah.
It seems like a no-brainer, but you'd be surprised how many landlords get tripped up by these seemingly small details.
It's all about dotting your I's and crossing your T's. These details might seem insignificant, but they can have huge consequences if overlooked. Remember, the law often hinges on these seemingly minor points.
Okay, so we've covered the importance of clear communication, proper deadlines, and avoiding retaliatory actions. But what about the actual delivery of the notice?
Right.
Is there a right way to do it?
There absolutely is. In California, you have a few options: personal delivery posting on the property or mailing it to the tenant's last known address.
Okay.
Each method has specific requirements to ensure it's considered legally served.
So no slipping it under the door or sending a quick text.
Definitely not. Those methods wouldn't hold up in court if the tenant decided to challenge the notice.
Ooh.
For example, if you're serving the notice personally, you need to make a reasonable effort to hand it directly to the tenant. And if they're not home, you need to follow specific procedures for what's called substituted service.
So it's not just about getting the content right. It's about understanding the proper procedures for every step of the process. It sounds like there's a lot more to unpack here.
There is, and unfortunately, serving the notice is just the beginning.
Right.
If the tenant fails to comply, there are additional legal steps involved, like filing an unlawful detainer lawsuit.
That sounds intimidating. What exactly does that mean, and what should landlords know about it?
It definitely sounds more intimidating than it is.
Okay. Basically, it's the legal term for the eviction process here in California.
Exactly.
If a tenant fails to respond to a 3-day notice to pay rent, the landlord can file this lawsuit to formally regain possession of the property.
Right.
So it's like the official legal channel for pursuing an eviction.
Exactly. It involves filing paperwork with the court and going through a formal legal process, which can take some time and may involve court appearances.
Okay.
But it's important to understand that the 3-day notice is a necessary first step. It's like laying the groundwork for a strong legal case.
That makes sense. So let's shift gears a bit and dive into the specifics of the 3-day notice itself.
Okay.
What are the essential components that absolutely must be included to make it legally sound?
Think of it like a checklist. You need to tick off every box to ensure its validity. First and foremost, you need to clearly identify the tenant or tenants to whom the notice is addressed. Use their full legal names as they appear on the lease agreement. No nicknames or abbreviations.
So we're talking the full legal names, no shortcuts.
Precision is key here. You also need to accurately identify the rental property itself, including the full address.
Got it. The who and the where. Now, what about the why?
Right.
I mean, the reason for the notice.
Of course, the notice must clearly state the reason for its issuance, which in this case is the failure to pay rent. You need to specify the exact amount of rent that is past due, no rounding up or adding any late fees that aren't explicitly mentioned in the lease agreement.
It sounds like sticking to the facts and figures outlined in the lease is crucial.
Exactly. No room for interpretation or adding extra charges on the fly. And speaking of figures, you also need to clearly state the deadline for payment. This is where those 3 business days we discussed earlier come into play. Remember, accurately calculating the deadline is vital, taking into account weekends and any legal holidays.
Right, because a miscalculation could invalidate the entire notice.
Yes.
So double-checking the calendar is a must. Okay, we've got the tenant's information, property details, the reason for the notice, the amount owed, and the payment deadline.
Right.
What else needs to be on this checklist to make the notice bulletproof?
You'll need to provide clear and concise instructions on how the tenant can make the payment.
Okay.
Specify the acceptable methods, whether it's cash check money order or online transfer. Include your contact information, a mailing address, or an online payment portal if applicable.
So basically make it as easy as possible for them to pay.
Absolutely. Remember, the primary goal is to get paid and resolve the issue. You don't want to create unnecessary hurdles. Now, while the notice is about demanding payment, it's also essential to include a statement informing the tenant of their right to dispute the notice or request a rent reduction under certain circumstances.
So even though we're talking about unpaid rent, we still need to acknowledge the tenant's rights.
Absolutely. This demonstrates that you're acting in good faith and following proper legal procedures. It can also help avoid any potential claims of unfair or deceptive practices. Down the line, transparency is key.
That makes sense. Transparency and following the proper procedures seem to be recurring themes here.
They are. And lastly, don't forget to date and sign the notice yourself. This verifies its authenticity and shows you're treating the matter seriously.
So it's not just a fill-in-the-blank form letter. There's a personal responsibility aspect to it as well. Okay, we've ticked all the boxes on our checklist. But what happens if, despite all this, a tenant tries to dispute the notice?
That's a valid concern, and it happens more often than you might think. One common argument from tenants is that they never received the notice, especially if it wasn't personally served.
So this goes back to the importance of proper service and having a solid record of how and when the notice was delivered.
Precisely. If you can't prove the tenant received the notice, they might have grounds to challenge the eviction process. That's why meticulously documenting every step of the service process, like who you spoke to, the date and time, and any other relevant details, is crucial.
What other reasons might a tenant use to contest the notice?
Sometimes they might argue that the rent amount is incorrect or that they've already paid, even if it's not true.
So apart from meticulous record keeping for serving the notice, it sounds like maintaining detailed records of rent payments and all communication with tenants about rent is critical for landlords.
Absolutely. Think of it like building a fortress of documentation. You want to be prepared to defend yourself against any potential challenges.
Okay, so we've got proper service, detailed content, and good record keeping. What else can landlords do to protect themselves and make sure the 3-day notice to pay rent is used effectively?
This goes back to what I mentioned earlier about understanding the bigger picture.
Okay.
The 3-day notice is just one step in a potentially lengthy process.
Uh-huh.
It's about knowing what happens next if the tenant fails to pay or vacate.
You're talking about the unlawful detainer lawsuit we discussed earlier.
Exactly. You might need to be prepared to navigate the court system, and that can be quite daunting for someone unfamiliar with legal procedures.
It sounds like having a legal professional on your side could be invaluable in these situations.
Absolutely. They can guide you through the complexities, ensure you're following proper procedures, and represent you in court if necessary. Think of them as your legal Sherpa, helping you navigate the treacherous terrain of the eviction process.
So knowledge is power, but having expert guidance can make all the difference.
Precisely. And remember, the goal isn't necessarily to evict a tenant, but to resolve the issue fairly and efficiently.
Right. It's about finding a solution that works for both parties, which sometimes might involve going beyond the pay or get out scenario.
Exactly. You might be able to negotiate a payment plan or work with the tenant to find alternative housing.
So communication and a willingness to explore different options can go a long way.
They can, but it's also important to remember that the 3-day notice is a serious legal document and shouldn't be used lightly or as a way to harass or intimidate tenants.
It's a tool to be used responsibly and only when other attempts at resolutions have failed.
Exactly. If you're ever unsure about whether or not to issue a notice, it's always wise to consult with a legal professional. They can provide personalized advice tailored to your specific situation.
That's great advice. Well, we've covered a lot of ground so far, from the nitty-gritty details of the 3-day notice to the broader context of the eviction process. But don't worry, we're not done yet. We'll be back in the next part with some real-life scenarios, tips on avoiding common mistakes, and additional resources to help you navigate the world of landlord-tenant law successfully. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Keys to Success. We've spent the last 2 parts of this episode really dissecting the 3-day notice to pay rent in California, covering everything from its legal importance to the specific details that need to be included.
We've talked about the importance of proper service, thorough documentation, and understanding the broader legal context of evictions.
But now let's get down to brass tacks and talk about some real-life situations that landlords might encounter.
Great idea. Let's say, for instance, you have a tenant who consistently pays rents late. They're always a few days behind, but they eventually cough up the full amount.
That's a tough one. It's not like they're refusing to pay, but those late payments can really throw a wrench in your budgeting and make it hard to manage your finances.
Exactly, and that's where good communication comes into play. Before you even think about issuing a 3-day notice, try having a conversation with the tenant to understand the reason for those late payments. Maybe they have a fluctuating income or are dealing with a temporary financial hardship.
So instead of jumping straight to the legal route, try to see if there's a way to work things out amicably.
Exactly. You might be able to adjust the due date to better align with their pay schedule, or perhaps you can work out a mutually agreeable payment plan.
That sounds a lot less stressful than going through the whole eviction process. But what if those late payments continue even after you've tried to be flexible and understanding?
Well, then the 3-day notice becomes a necessary tool to protect your interests and ensure you're getting paid what you're owed. It's about setting clear boundaries and expectations.
Okay, let's switch gears to another tricky scenario. What if a tenant claims they made a partial rent payment, but you have no record of it?
That's where those meticulous records we talked about earlier become your saving grace. Always document all rent payments, whether they come in the form of a check money order or online transfer.
So if a tenant insists they paid, but your records tell a different story, what's a landlord to do? It feels like a potential he said, she said situation waiting to happen.
You hit the nail on the head. That's why having that paper trail is so crucial. You can politely request proof of payment from the tenant, like a bank statement or a canceled check. If they can't provide any documentation, it becomes more challenging.
So it's their word against yours, and in those situations, it's the landlord who's often at a disadvantage.
Unfortunately, that can be the case, and it highlights why landlords need to be proactive about documentation and treat every transaction with a tenant as a potential legal matter. It's not about being distrustful, it's about protecting yourself.
Okay, so we've got communication, flexibility, and documentation as key themes. Now, what about some common mistakes that landlords make when it comes to using the 3-day notice? I'm sure there are some pitfalls we can help our listeners avoid.
Absolutely. One of the most frequent mistakes is including improper fees or charges in the rent amount. Remember, you can only demand the unpaid rent as specified in the lease agreement.
So no tacking on late fees or other penalties unless they're explicitly stated in the lease.
Exactly. You can't just decide to add extra charges on a whim. Everything needs to be clearly outlined in the lease agreement. Another common error is, as we've discussed, failing to serve the notice correctly. It seems simple, but there are specific rules you need to follow.
Right, because as we learned earlier, even a minor misstep in the service process can render the entire notice invalid.
Precisely. And finally, some landlords mistakenly believe that once those 3 days are up, they can immediately proceed with an eviction.
Oh, so there are more steps involved.
Yes, the 3-day notice is just the first step in a longer process. If the tenant fails to pay or vacate within those 3 days, you'll likely need to file that unlawful detainer lawsuit we discussed earlier.
So it's not an automatic eviction. It's the beginning of a legal process that can potentially lead to an eviction.
Exactly, and it's important to go into this process with a clear understanding of what's involved and a willingness to seek legal guidance when needed.
Well, I think we've covered just about everything there is to know about the 3-day notice to pay rent in California. We've explored the essential elements, the importance of proper service, real-life scenarios, common mistakes to avoid, and the broader context of the eviction process.
Remember, using this tool effectively requires a combination of knowledge preparation and, importantly, good judgment. It's not just about following the letter of the law, it's also about understanding its spirit, which is to ensure a fair and balanced process for both landlords and tenants.
And if you ever find yourself facing a tricky situation or have any doubts, don't hesitate to reach out to a qualified legal professional.
They can provide expert advice, help you navigate the often complex world of landlord-tenant law, and ensure you're protecting your rights and interests every step of the day.
Great advice. We hope this deep dive into the 3-day notice to pay rent has been helpful for all you landlords out there. Remember, knowledge is power when it comes to successful property management.
And always remember to consult with a legal professional to ensure your actions are in line with current California law.
Until next time on Keys to Success, happy renting, everyone.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Keys to Success. I invite you to check out past episodes and follow us on your favorite podcast platform to get notified when new ones are released. And when you're ready to simplify managing your properties, be sure to visit us at www.payrent.com.